Pokemon has been around for almost 27 years. Since then, we've had 9 generations and over 1,000 Pokemon to fill our Pokédexes. Each game in this series is a unique, totally not cut and paste game from the other. Today I'll be ranking every Pokemon game and putting them all on a tier list. Starting first and with the series' most iconic Pokemon games, Red and Blue. These games are iconic for several reasons, and since these games were Pokemon's first rodeo, I'll put them in a solid B tier. These games are definitely dated and don't hold up at all, but for 1996, these games were revolutionary. Every Pokemon game definitely gets the formula from these games: beat all 8 gyms, stop an evil team, and become champion. The Pokemon in these games are also pretty cool as well. Charizard, Lapras, and Flareon are my favorites. They also had a whole caveat of glitches which were pretty iconic, such as Missing No. These games also had the game corner, which were one of my favorite parts of the game. Blue is also an amazing rival as well. For those reasons, these games go into the B tier. Pokemon Yellow is also B tier as well. This game was the definitive version of Pokemon Red and Blue, which introduced several new features. The first of which is making this game feel like the anime. You get a starter Pikachu, and the teams in these games actually reflect the trainers in anime. There was also a Surfing Pikachu minigame, and Charizard can finally learn Fly. Also, they remodeled the sprites of some of the characters in Pokemon. Also, all the good stuff carries over from Red and Blue. The only real issue is that these games are dated and have glitches, so for that they're in B tier. They are ahead of Red and Blue though. Moving on to the second generation of Pokemon, we have Gold and Silver. These games were intended to be the final game in the series. Thank God they were not. I tolerate these games. They're okay. They're not terribly difficult. Winnie's Miltank, Claire, and Lance can be hard, but that's about it. In terms of new Pokemon, I would honestly say it's pretty weak in terms of coolness. There are like 10 Pokemon lines that I actually like. All the others are weak and underwhelming compared to later Pokemon and the previous generation. There were some cool things in these games, like the legendary lore. I also liked the locations in these games, and they felt like they had a lot of exploration. Including Kanto was pretty good, so yeah, I think these games are definitely a step up above Red and Blue and Yellow, and they're still in B tier because once again, these games are pretty dated. Same with Crystal, honestly. It's a great game and made massive improvements on the original. For example, they expanded on the legendary beasts lore from the previous games and gave Suicune more of a personality. I like how both legendaries are obtainable in these games, which is pretty cool. Once again, I think they balance 2 regions perfectly. I do think B tier. Not including Ampharos was pretty stupid. Once again, these games did not age well, so they're definitely high B tier. They're by far the best games on the original Game Boy. Next is Ruby and Sapphire. These games are definitely A tier. They have actually aged pretty well and don't feel repetitive to go back through. To put it simply, these games are just plain fun. Team Magma and Aqua are also pretty fun to watch because their plot makes no sense at all. I think these games also provide a perfect mix of challenge as opposed to being too hard or just too easy. I really love the gym leaders in these games. I think they use pretty cool teams. The Pokemon introduced in these games were pretty fun as well, and it's one of my favorite generations in terms of overall Pokemon. The starter trio introduced in this game is still my favorite starter trio of all time, even to this day. These games are what Pokemon should be, and they never feel repetitive at any point. I've actually gone back and played these games multiple times for Nuzlocke and just casual playthroughs, and it never gets stale, so these games are definitely high A tier. Emerald took this almost peak game and just added more stuff. They expanded on the Rayquaza lore and made the team slightly harder and better. They also added one of the best cutscenes in all of Pokemon still to this day. I also love the Battle Frontier, which is a mechanic missed by many. These games are definitely S tier. They're some of the best Game Boy games of all time, period. In fact, tell me your favorite Pokemon game down in the comments below. While you're down there, you might as well subscribe to the channel for daily content and boosted shiny odds. Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green were also games that released on the Game Boy Advance. These games were a massive graphical improvement from the original. They're nowhere near as dated as their predecessors and are a great introduction to new Pokemon fans. All the glitches in Red and Blue are now gone as well, so these games go into low A tier behind Ruby and Sapphire. The Game Boy era overall was pretty good. It felt with Emerald that these games finally got their footing down because Generation 4 was the best generation in Pokemon history. Diamond and Pearl were the first Pokemon DS games which were introduced in 2007. These games added a whole bunch of stuff, including improved graphics, the Pokewalker, new quality of life features, and a whole lot more. Cyrus is a great villain and I loved his Shakespeare rants. I love the Pokemon introduced in these games, and the starter trio is amazing. Barry is an amazing rival as well. I also love how hard the game is for Nuzlocking, and it's a super fun game to go back to. These games also introduce the physical and special split. For those who don't know, before the physical and special split, move category of physical and special was determined by type. This hurt a bunch of Pokemon such as Gyarados, who had a monstrous attack stat but couldn't take advantage of its water typing. After this, there were physical water moves, so Gyarados could effectively use its water type. My only major issue with these games was the horrible type spread in the Pokedex. Having 2 fire type lines and overrepresenting types like water is completely ridiculous. These games also had a lot of grinding, especially towards the end of the game. Upon my first playthrough, I spent a week grinding the Elite Four. It also doesn't help how slow these games are. For that, these games are going in low A tier, ahead of Ruby and Sapphire. But like Ruby and Sapphire, Platinum came and fixed these games up. For starters, they introduced a new and improved Pokédex that let Pokemon evolve before the post-game, and they also introduced a more evenly type spread in the Pokédex. They also introduced the Distortion role, which is pretty cool as well. The grinding from Volknar to Cynthia is much better in Platinum than Diamond and Pearl, as Cynthia's level cap is decreased. The games also run overall faster. Platinum also had some pretty cool characters, like Looker, who is missed by many. This game also had the Deck Snap feature, which allowed for easy shiny Pokemon. For that, these games are an S tier, but a little bit behind Emerald. Taking a trip back to Johto, we have Heart Gold and Soul Silver. These games came out in 2011, and for a while were considered to be some of the best Pokemon games. They made massive graphical improvements from the original, and much more. For starters, adding Kanto was once again perfectly balanced, and including Pokemon up until Generation 4 was a great addition. Kanto was pretty fun, and battling Red towards the game was an experience that I'll never forget. This was also the first time we ever had following Pokemon, which is the one takeaway most fans have from these games. Silver was also a pretty good rival as well, with him being the son of Team Rocket. The Safari Zone we also got was the best in series history, having different biomes and a wide variety of Pokemon. Overall, these games are pretty good, but the grinding and the level curves are pretty bad, so for that, they're low A tier. After this came Pokemon Black and White. These games were very controversial at the start because they only let you use the Unova Pokedex Pokemon before you beat the league. This means you can only use new Unovan Pokemon. I actually don't mind this because the Unova designs were pretty cool. These games had a lot of cool stuff going for it. For starters, N is my favorite Pokemon character of all time because he's super interesting. I like the plot twist at the game where instead of fighting the champion Alder, you fight N and Ghetsis. In terms of other things, I liked how this game introduced some of the best characters. Cheren and Bianca were pretty cool rivals that never felt dull and had their own personality. Also, one thing I liked in these games was the fact that the gym leaders didn't feel like static characters who you battled once and never saw again. It felt like they had responsibilities and they had personalities. Having them impact the story was pretty fun as well, especially at the end where they all show up to assist the player in fighting N. They also have a pretty cool post-game where you can catch other Pokemon from other generations. These games are high S tier and are above Platinum but not ahead of Emerald. Pokemon Black 2 and White 2 were also controversial for not being third versions but rather sequels. I love this idea as it gives a new take on the region. My problem with third versions is that they can be pretty repetitive, playing the same game all over again with some quality of life improvements. You have a new rival named Sven, which is pretty cool. The gym leaders also changed, which is also pretty cool as well. Cheren, the original rival, is now the first gym leader, and there's some other changes to the gym, such as Roxy being the new poison trainer. You can use Pokemon from other regions in these games, which is pretty cool. There are also some pretty cool Easter eggs in these games, such as Crouch or Wake making an appearance. Actually, every past gym leader makes an appearance in the Pokemon World Tournament. This is such a missed feature. Basically, past gym leaders and other characters would fight you in a tournament. They have actually good teams with items as well. Other people such as Wolfie VGC also made appearances in these games as well. These games also had a pretty cool post-game overall, so for that they're in high S tier, surpassing Emerald to be in the top spot, at least for now. The last couple of generations have been peak Pokemon, but that all changes with Pokemon X and Y. These games, still to this day, are incredibly controversial. There were very easy games, which I pretty much agree with. The gym leaders and all other major bosses are very underwhelming. These games did look pretty nice graphically and introduced some cool locations, plus riding Pokemon was pretty cool as well. The Pokemon introduced in these games looked pretty cool as well. My personal favorites were Greninja and Hawlucha. These games are also great for Nuzlocking due to their diverse Pokédex and Mega Evolution, as well as the brand new Fairy type. Mega Evolution is my favorite Pokemon gimmick of all time. For those reasons, these games are in B tier ahead of Gold and Silver. Next up are the Hoenn remakes Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. These games are like Ruby and Sapphire with a code of X and Y on them. They had Mega Pokemon as well as new graphics. These games were pretty fun and added some new quality of life features such as giving us a free Latios after all 5 badges. These games also had Mega Evolution as well as the physical special split. They also had the new Fairy type, which is pretty cool. These games also had the Deck Snap feature, which allowed Pokemon players to have rare Pokemon. Overall, these games are in low A tier as I do like the originals slightly more for some reason that I can't put my finger on. Maybe it's nostalgia. Kicking off Generation 7, we have Pokemon Sun and Moon. These games were also fairly controversial when they released because they were so difficult. Many people put them in the same tier as difficulty ROM hacks such as Renegade Platinum and Inclement Emerald. I personally love these games for the difficulty. The starter trio in these games were also pretty cool as well. These games also introduced regional variants, which is another favorite gimmick of mine. While most of the regional variants didn't really stick the landing with the exception of Alolan Muck and Raichu, they set the groundwork for some really cool ones. For that, they go into B tier. Ultra Sun and Moon came in and added a few new things. Ultra Necrozma was pretty cool lore-wise, and I actually beat it on my first try without using fear. I used all 3 starters in my playthrough as well as a Lycanroc, an Alolan Raichu, and a Nagadadle. Speaking of cool things, the Ultra Beasts were really cool as well as the Ultra Wormholes. The Ultra Wormholes were actually pretty cool due to their boosted shiny odds. For that, these games go into B tier ahead of Sun and Moon. With that, we get to Generation 8, Sword and Shield. These games are easily the worst in the franchise. While graphically they look fine, they were lacking in other areas. For starters, the game is too easy because Dynamax is such a broken mechanic. Dexit also hurt these games a lot in my eyes. The characters aren't really that interesting with the exception of Claire or Avery depending on what version of the game you're playing. Leon the Champion is also incredibly underwhelming. I did like the new Pokemon introduced in these games, so that's pretty much the only redeeming factor it has. My personal favorite is Dreadnought. I did like the DLC, mainly Dynamax Adventures. I've expressed my opinions on this in previous videos, but to keep things short, they're fun and they never really get repetitive. Shiny hunting for legendaries is also pretty fun. I got diagnosed with COVID 2 months after the DLC came out, but hey, I got a shiny Rayquaza, so it was pretty much fine. These games are definitely C tier. Dynamax Adventures and the new Pokemon are the only redeeming factors in these games. After this, we got Legends Arceus. Take the Pokemon formula and throw it out the window. These games are easy A tier. I loved how they mixed it up even though it felt like a rough draft sometimes. I love how catching Pokemon was prioritized even though it's a bit boring to travel around the map sometimes. And I take it all back because Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl completely ruined everything. They barely changed anything from the originals. These games are easy D tier. Sure, they have some cool new things like character customization and it's Sinnoh, but that's pretty much about it. There's a lot of bad stuff present in these games. HMs and the low speed are gone, but they're basically no improvements, and that's super disappointing compared to all the other remakes. So for that, they're in D tier, easily the worst Pokemon games of all time. Lastly, we have the Generation 9 games Scarlet and Violet. These games were cool for being open world. I did like how they have 3 stories. The Pokemon introduced in these games were pretty average, however. These games are definitely B tier. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Comment, like, and subscribe for more Pokemon content. If you have a video suggestion, let me know down in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you on the flip, whatever that means.